It's a wonderful occasion for me, and I'm very, very happy that you asked me to come and do this. And I really appreciate all the questions and discussions that we've been having, which is really very helpful. So let me put this last talk, which is a bit more technical, in some perspective. The word epistemology has a bit narrower meaning in English than it is in French. In French, epistemology means the whole philosophy of science, whereas in English we just mean theory of knowledge, belief, opinion, right? So in that narrow sense, constructive empiricism is not an epistemology, but it is. But the whole point of view would be moot. That would be just not start. If one admitted a certain kind of more realistic epistemology, including things like interest and best explanation in a very strong form, and so on. So, if I want to be a constructive empiricist, if I wanted to be, then I had to develop also an epistemology in this narrower sense, and I wanted to work on a probabilist epistemology in the tradition of Pascal. As I talking about it yesterday with some people at dinner, I said we have to admit that probabilist epistemology, formal epistemology, is still very simplistic, and is constantly running into more problems that have to be dealt with. So it's when people speak so proudly of Bayesian epistemology, I think that they are certainly overstating what they have been able to do. So what I want to do today is suggest a particular approach, a bit broader than is usual, I think, in order to contribute to the development of this epistemology. So, to begin then, about managing our opinion, I would like to make a distinction in narrow epistemology between discussing agents and discussing patients. An agent is someone who develops a policy for managing his beliefs and opinions. Whereas a patient is someone who instantiates a policy. May or may not have a policy, it may not have developed a policy, but just happens to act in accordance to the rules, so to speak. And I think that much of the discussion has been in terms of what is the history of a patient like? What is a good epistemic history to have? And I think that we should take a more active approach. We should talk about developing policies and what are the constraints on a good policy, while admitting in a very liberal way that there may be many different policies that could be rationally appropriate. For example, that some people may have a higher risk quotient than others. That it may not be rational for you to be more averse to risk or more inclined to take risks. And these would be aspects of different policies that you could develop. So what are the criteria for a good policy? Now, one criticism that we hear very often about formal epistemology is that it deals with something much too idealized, and that all our human shortcomings stand in the way of, for instance, being a Bayesian agent, right? Now, I think there are two approaches to this point about our frailty, our sin, and our shortcomings. Two opposite extremes, right? One extreme, I think, is illustrated by the Dutch pirates. Very often, they would get their crew before telling the crew that they were going to be pirates. And then the ship would sail out, and as soon as it was outside the harbor, the captain would get everybody together and take the Bible and formally throw it overboard and say, this is the sin for which there's no forgiveness. Now you're all going to hell, we're all going to hell, so we can do anything. And the first deontic logic that was developed in the middle of the 20th century had essentially this character, that something ought to be the case. That means if it's not the case, then Okay, there's no that all hell breaks loose. Okay. Well, everybody agreed that this was too naive and beyond logic, and these, I guess, Calvinist pirates were too extreme too, right? So the alternative is to have what we call casuistry. Oh, that's not right. There. Pascal discusses the Jesuits, who the Jesuits admit that people sin, and so they have these books of casuistry, which is, first of all, you ought not to steal. But then, if you do steal, that's not the end of the matter. Then a new command comes in: you should make restitution. Well, you may not even do that. If you steal and you don't make restitution, then, so you know. And Pascal thought this was total hypocrisy. He thought that the Jesuits were advising people how to be sinners. And he gave the example in one of the books of casuistry: a priest should not go to a bordello. But if the priest goes to a bordello, he should not wear his cassock. Now, I think Pascal is wrong here. I mean, I think Pascal is a great philosopher, but I think that he's wrong. I think that there is no way to develop a theory that would never need casuistry. Okay? You might as well look at something quite ideal, because no matter how unideal you make it, there will always be a need for further casuistry. Right? There will always be norms and obligations coming in from some other concern that will interfere with what you are doing. So that's why I think it is, after all right for us to concentrate on a rather ideal case. Someone who is developing a policy, and we're not going to think too much about how he might fail accidentally in carrying out the policy, right? So I'll focus on the rather ideal form. I'll say, let's talk about people, epistemic agents who develop policies, and not worry too much about how they might fail to carry them out, and just ask, what are going to be the rational constraint on policies? And these will be policies for having subjective probabilities and changing them. For instance, as you get more experience or as you think about the subject, you may change your probabilities. So at the moment, I have a quite high probability that tomorrow will be a very warm day in Ottawa, where I'm going to be. I looked at the weather forecast and so on. It will be rather warm for the season. But look, if tonight I see other evidence, I will start changing that, right? I will change my right? So the question is, how do you manage this? How do you manage this? How do you change and so on, right? And what could be I'm not going to say what is the right policy. I'm going to say what are the constraints on good policies. So a policy will have to do three things. It will have to show how to react to a variety of inputs. So we need a typology of inputs. Inputs that are not ruled out already by your prior opinion. And it has to specify the range of admitted possible responses. Not going to say that there's one response that is the right one, but say, well, this range of responses would be okay. The inputs, I say we need a typology of input. The Bayesians typically just talk about something that comes to you that you're immediately certain about. You see it, you know it. It's as if experience speaks with the voice of an angel and tells you what is the case. Well, that's not how all experience is, right? You may have to think about other kinds of input from experience that is not so definite. But whatever the input is, its function is to put a constraint on my posterior opinion. So I have a prior opinion, what I have now. I have some experience, I have some input. It puts a constraint on what my next experience can be. And this constraint could be stronger or weaker. What the inputs are may not be themselves describable in the language that the agent has. some of it may be, you know, just, what should I say, brute experience. You walk into a room, you see a fire. No, well, the fire I can describe, but maybe you see something you can't describe, right? Or you don't have a very exact description of it to give. But the envisaged possibilities, they form a small algebra, a structure that is much poorer than the structure of the world that we take ourselves to live in. So I'm thinking of my world picture as a small structure that I hope is embeddable in the world as it really is. The little one is my picture of what the world is like. And the real world, of course, is very rich and complex and has all kinds of arguments. Right? But there may still be a match at the superficial level that my opinion proceeds. Now, the basic criterion should be this. I mean, this is surely the minimal criterion. A policy, the design of a policy should not be such as to make failure inevitable. But what is failure here? Well, I'm going to ask for something quite concrete. A failure would be, and we could say the failure is inevitable if it is clear that the person's opinion could not be in accord with the statistics. So if I have the opinion that it is typically cold in Ottawa in April, right, that may very well be in accord with statistics, right? It maybe in such a simple case, it would be very hard for me to have an opinion that couldn't possibly be in accord with the statistics. Something like, it's both cold and warm at the same time. No, I'm not going to have that opinion, right? But when it comes to changing your opinion over time, it may be not quite so easy to make sure that your opinions could be tracking the statistics. So I'm going to give you an example. And at first, I think this example will sound quite plausible. I hope it does. The doctor says, yeah, well, I don't know. She's talking about a particular condition that you may have, an illness of some sort. And he said, I'm not sure. At the moment, as far as your symptoms are concerned, 50-50 that you have this condition. So I'm going to give you a test. I'm going to have a test. And this test, if the outcome is positive, then, yeah, okay, then I'll be sure that you have this condition and we'll treat it and it will be fine. If the outcome of the test is negative, unfortunately, we'll have to do other tests because it doesn't change the probability. It'll still be 50-50. That's what he says. Doesn't sound very plausible, right? If we do that test and it comes out negative, well, we still won't know and so on, right? But actually, this talking about how he will manage his opinion in response to the test is a policy which cannot possibly track the statistics. Well, I shouldn't say not possibly, but you'll see it's very unlikely. So suppose that the details are this, that he says if you test it and it's positive, 90% probability that you have this condition X. If you test it and negative, still 50% probability. And he doesn't tell you what's the probability if you're not tested, right? But look, the probability overall of having it has to be an average of the three. Now, the average between 90 and 50 is, you know, even the weighted average is somewhere in between the two, definitely higher than 50. So the only way it could come out to be 50 if not being tested is very good for you. Right? And I don't think that the doctor means that. Okay? He doesn't think that people who are not tested have any better chance of being well, right? So if he thinks that no, that's the same, then his opinion cannot track the statistics. Okay? So you see that it is not so difficult to violate this basic criterion. Right? All right, but so this is just what I just said. Okay.
But it has to be with average. Why don't you put 50% also in the last column? He has 50% of having the thing when not tested.
No, you don't know.
Yeah, suppose that you put 50% there, okay? In that case, the average of 90, 50, and 50 is going to be higher than 50. Yeah.
But the average has to be weighted. It
Yes.
depends how many times you will get a positive test. And how many times you will get nothing.
No matter what, that's right, but no matter how you weight the three numbers, as long as they all have a positive weight, the outcome will be higher than 50.
Yes.
Unless not being tested really lowers the probability of the illness.
I think that the weighting is only concerning the, should distinguish on the one hand the testing case or the non-testing case. I mean, I don't think you can make the probability over these three cases. That's my intuition, but okay.
Well, in that case, perhaps we should just think that the doctor doesn't even think about the untested cases, and we just look at the two, and then the same have the same point. Right. So now, what we need, of course, is we need to have a criterion that we can apply to say when is the policy okay in this respect, and when is the policy violating this constraint. And intuitively, as I said, the criterion is the policy must not preclude tracking the statistics over time. Now, here I'm going to tell you, I'm going to offer you a criterion that can be applied when you see what the policy is, and that is that always the current expectation values are somewhere between the extremes of what you foresee as your possible future expectation values. So, for instance, I say, I think tomorrow will be warm, and my opinion may change. But now to be satisfied this criterion, I have to say it may change up or down. If I already say my opinion, my probability is going to go up, then you should ask me, why isn't it up now? Right? Okay. So this is the spanning criterion, which is directly applicable and not just intuitive. And well, I'm not going to give you the proof that these are exactly the same criterion, really, right? But I'm going to just illustrate it, just explain it a bit. So this graph would show someone who is violating it. So suppose that there are 4 alternatives that he is thinking about, and the second one has relatively high probability. And then he says, now we will do a test, or we'll have more information coming in, and after that, my opinion will be one of these 3. But look, in each case, this has gone down. Yeah. So he's already telling us that this is too high. Well, then there's something wrong if his policy is of that sort. Of course, if he ever found it was like that, then we could say, oh, throw away the prior. Right? This would be another way to react to it. But there's something wrong there. So the theorem, I'm not going to go through the proof, is that the tracking criterion is equivalent to this spanning condition. And then then let's see what implications that's going to have for the debates that go on in this general area. What kinds of policies are allowed and under what conditions. And this has quite a lot to do with what kind of input we are admitting as possible input in our experience. So the orthodox Bayesian view, as I said, the orthodox Bayesian thinks that your experience gives you a proposition and that you're immediately certain that this proposition is true. For instance, I walk in the room, I see Yvon, and so I got this proposition, and I'm immediately totally certain Yvon is in the room. Right? So the Bayesian only deals, the orthodox Bayesian, only deals with input of that sort. So he said, before, my opinion was that proposition A is definitely true. Now I get a new one, B, and I throw away all that is A and not B, and all my probability is on A and B. And that is called Bayesian conditionalization. Okay. Fine. Now, is that, the Bayesians often tend to talk as if that's the only possible rule to have. And so, over the years, there have been attempts to prove that this is the only possible rule to have. David Lewis gave a proof, and what is interesting about his proof is that if we look at it, we can see that there is a presupposition, an important presupposition. So he classifies an ideal agent as someone who has some foreknowledge. She doesn't know what the evidence will be, and she doesn't know what her future opinion will be. But what she knows is that what the evidence could be, she knows exactly what the evidence could be, all the different alternatives for the evidence, and she knows exactly for each possible evidence what her posterior opinion will be. And then on the basis of these assumptions, she can prove that Bayesian conditionalization is in fact the only possible rule. So this is all the things that he knows. You see, he knows what his opinion is now. He knows this, in this simple case, he knows that the test will have either yes or no, and he knows exactly what he will think after. And on that basis, you can prove that his rule is conditionalization. Very nice, right? But it's also a very strong premise, because in that respect, I think that his ideal agent is overly ideal. I'm not I said we're always going to need casuistry, but this is a very strong assumption of ideal character of the agent. So it is true that under these conditions you can quickly show that he satisfies the spanning condition, and you can show more. You can show that the only form of updating under those conditions is Bayesian conditionalization. All right, but now let's start looking at some departures from this very simple scheme. Departure 1. The agent cannot formulate the deliverance of experience. And this was begun by Richard Jeffrey. And his example is you walk into a room that is perhaps not very well lit. Beforehand, you knew that there was a vase with roses on the table. And it seemed very likely to you that the roses were pink. Sorry, not very likely that they were pink. Say 0.3, percentage 0.3. And he sees the roses as he walks through the room, and afterwards you say, what do you think now? And he says, oh, now it seems much more likely to me that they are pink. But he doesn't have a proposition that he got with certainty at all. He's just got a jump in his probability. So what happened? Well, there was an input that maybe he cannot describe, the experience he cannot describe, but the constraint to put on his posterior opinion is that this particular probability has a change from 0.3 to 0.7. And then he offered a rule. The rule that should be a policy for dealing with this. And that was that you should keep all your conditional probabilities the same as they were before. Okay? And there again, we have a very nice proof. In fact, it's a proof by symmetry reasoning that says, yes, if the prior and the experience are the only input, then this is the only rational rule. So again, we have something quite nice to prove. But you see that this agent is not of the sort that David Lewis described, because you can't probabilities the same as they were before. Okay? And there again, we have a very nice proof. In fact, it's a proof by symmetry reasoning that says, yes, if the prior and the experience are the only input, then this is the only rational rule. So again, we have something quite nice to prove. But you see that this agent is not of the sort that David Lewis described, because he can't conditionalize. His experience is not such that he could just conditionalize. Okay, let's go another step further. This was introduced by a physicist, James, who was working on statistical mechanics, and a very polemical writer about probability. Who had many followers, probably still does. He used information theory, and he said, you know, the input can be much broader even than what he didn't talk about Jeffrey, but what he gave was inputs of a sort that were much broader. For instance, what we call the expectation value of a quantity could change. And he didn't put any limit on it. We could have more examples of different input people could get. And his rule would always be, all right, you have your prior opinion. You have to construct your posterior opinion. And the information, the added information should be minimal. Be as conservative as possible with respect to the amount of information in your opinion. And of course, this is a technical notion of information that you can measure. It depends on how peaked your probabilities are or how spread out they are. Yeah, yes, it's the same as relative entropy. If your opinion is, all the same for all the alternatives, that would be informationless practically. If it's very peaked on one side, you save lots of information. So, and his recipe has been used, has had many applications. For instance, in this example you see here, they use it in order to enhance photos. You see, now you can see a bit more clearly what the photo is of once they apply the recipe. So it has had many successes of various sorts in application. The applications in thermodynamics and statistical mechanics are actually quite controversial, but certainly very interesting. Okay. Now, what about that policy? So I would like to see if we can apply the criterion that I offered you to this. And the example that I have, it's an old example, but it's one that I have changed my mind about a little bit. I doubt that anyone in this room has seen this movie called Private Benjamin. You see, I mean,
It's an old one.
yeah, I made up the example in what was it, 1970 some, and it was I had just seen this movie, okay, and Goldie Hawn joined the army, and he and her little troop are parachuted into an area in the desert, I think it is, or somewhere in the field during war games, and they are told to patrol and report back to headquarters, right? But they don't know where they are. They don't know where they are. They sit around a little campfire and smoke some dope, and they don't know what they're doing. So the blue area, they belong to the blue army, and it's dangerous for them to be in the red army part, and worst of all, to be in the red headquarters part. Okay? So she calls on the radio. And the radio officer listens to what she reports about the mountains and so on. And he says, not so sure, but if you are in the red part, the probability is 2 to 1 that you are in the headquarters. Now, in the movie, actually, they are, and they go and capture the enemy headquarters, but that's not part of my example, okay? The point is that, what is the information she gets? It's an if kind of information. The radio officer says nothing about how likely they are still in the blue area, or how likely they are in the red area. He just says, if you are in the red area, you're twice as likely to be in the headquarters part. Okay. How does she manage her opinion when she gets that? Now, if she uses James's rule, something surprising happens. What happens to her probability that she is in the blue area where she would like to be when she uses his rule to update? It becomes more likely that she's in the blue area. The probability that she's in the blue area rises. Now, it sounds like wishful thinking, right? I mean, why should that happen? But it is actually true, even if he says 10 to 1 or 1 to 10 or whatever. Any adjustment she makes with the James rule to her prior probability when she gets that form of information is to raise the probability of being in the blue area. And that seems to be a problem. It looks like you may have a violation of the tracking criterion here, right? Because you know beforehand that something is going to go up. Of course, you know that your opinion will change, but what you should be able to say is it will go either up or down. You should not be able to tell beforehand, yes, it will go up. Right? In the 70s, there was a big dispute about James's rule, and especially the Orthodox Bayesians were against it. But quite independent of that, we can ask whether the better general tracking condition is one that they may have difficulty with. And Kenneth Friedman, he said explicitly, you can't have a rule which is such that you know beforehand that the probability will go up, or know beforehand that the probability will go down, that means that we're already in a problem state. Well, I think this is the way in which I have changed my mind a little bit about this. It's when I started thinking about how exactly to specify what a policy should be. A policy should specify the possible inputs, right? And should specify the way to deal with each input. But the policy should, also say what are the inputs that are allowed. So in other words, they could be conditioned on a question you ask. The specific question you ask may limit the kind of inputs that you will get. Now, in the case of the doctor, he knows exactly what question he is putting because he knows he has a test. And the question is well defined beforehand, before he does a test. And he knows the possible answers. Okay, so he's in that position. But Judy Benjamin was not really in that position. She didn't know what form of input she would get, and she didn't put any limitations on it. She didn't say to the radio officer, I want an answer in the following form. Okay. And so if we allow that there was a much larger variety of possible inputs, then it's quite possible that the information rule would not violate the tracking criteria. But if we understand the example of the sort that could actually happen in a specifically well-designed experiment, where the answers are going to be in this if-then form, then James's rule violates the tracking condition. So, although I was just submitting an absolutely minimal criterion as far as I could see, it's still the case that rules that have a real use in the area and that are seriously propounded and actually applied, there are conditions under which using that rule will violate the tracking criteria. So the rules would have a rule like that would have to be qualified by saying we have to limit it in certain conditions and not apply it in other conditions. So just try to summarize a little bit and finally about how I see the situation. I do not think that rationality should be equated with rule following. I don't think that rationality rules out a certain liberty with respect to the policies we devise, and even when we have a policy, that it should rule out a kind of liberty because it may allow for cases where you come to a point and you say, yeah, well, I'll make up my mind, I'll tell you tomorrow, right? And exercise your free will. I don't see how rationality can rule that out, but sometimes you have to do that. But nevertheless, there are strong rational constraints. That voluntarism in epistemology doesn't mean anything goes. There are strong rational constraints. It still leaves a good deal of leeway. And I would say that even accepting that under normal conditions, you can have a principle updating policy that can just be applied automatically. But it may still leave some options for choice. It may presuppose favorable conditions. It will definitely need casuistry of various sorts. And it should allow for revolutionary changes. That if you follow the policy and everything goes wrong, the policy should not be such as to preclude throwing away your prior. But it is quite different. What I'm suggesting is that we should be discussing these matters in a rather different way from the typical Bayesian discussion, which is all about is this a good history of the person's epistemic life. We should try to bring in commitment, inertia, and opinion as having a value too, recalcitrance, and we should also means don't insist on a certain form of input when you ask your questions. That's it.
is a principle or a maxim for the Jesuits that doesn't admit any casuistry.
Oh.
Dedendi a cadavere. You have to obey like a cadaver, like a dead man. That's a maxim in the Jesuit party.
But if there's a great deal of casuistry to show what you have to obey, then perhaps it may not be so. Pascal was saying it is much too liberal once you look at all the, all the exceptions.
Thank you for a splendid talk. Do you think that this rules out any normative value for the Bayesian epistemology? Because at a very abstract level, it can be still be sort of a good minimal policy for an ideal agent.
Yeah.
I think that Lewis mentions that a number of times.
Well, I think that there are, in fact, very well-designed scientific experiments where the questions are well-defined beforehand, the range of possible answers, and the reactions to the answers are all well-defined beforehand, which sometimes happens. There, David Lewis's description fits. And there, I would say, yes, Bayesian conditionalization is the exact thing to do. Now, what I complain is that in the philosophical literature in epistemology, what they call formal epistemology, people have concentrated almost entirely on that case, you see? And that's not realistic. So I would say it has a very limited application.
One more question, maybe. I wonder if you're a pluralist when it comes to interpreting probabilities. I mean, there is the subjective interpretation. You seem to favor, as an empiricist, the statistical type of stability. But there are other interesting conceptual interpretation of probability, including dispositional. Do you rule them out, or are you a pluralist on this?
No, in that I'm not going. I don't want to go that far in my pluralism. I see. Okay, basically, I think of probability as weighted opinion. Okay, subjective, in other words, personal. But I see an enormous value for the frequentist interpretation as illuminating the criteria of success for opinion. So, I mean, all right, your opinion that's yours, but it doesn't mean that every opinion is equally good. Your opinion should be able to track the statistics, you see, and that's the frequency side, right? Now, when it comes to dispositions or objective chance, you see, I guess it gets too metaphysical for me. Objective chance is a kind of graded necessity in nature, right? And that doesn't mean that the formal development may not actually give us some new insight in the theory. And this is something I often want to concede to metaphysics, that they develop new interpretations. What I'm not willing to say is that they're on the way to finding the truth.
I had a question. Well, when I was listening to your talk, I kept thinking about those experiments in psychology, showing that many people just don't follow the rules of probability, and even when you explain to them it doesn't work.
I know.
They still don't follow the rules. Would that call for another modification in a theory?
No. This is where I would like to say, don't try to modify the formal theory of opinion, but rather look at the conditions for the people. And these experiments, when they were repeated, often showed that the form of the question that was put to the subjects had a lot to do with how they reacted. And so that means then that the model that only has information and probability in it is too limited. That there were other factors that really should be put into the model of human behavior.
Very campaign.
Yes, exactly. So that it may not be that the theory is at fault, but rather that the model may have been kept too small. See? Nevertheless, as also there is irrational behavior. I mean, a friend at one point got me into going to the racetrack a lot and gambling on the horses. And I would listen to the people putting their bets, and they would rattle off like 5 bets in a row, and I think, they might be making book against themselves. They're just going with hunches and this and that, right? And so we can't rule that out. But then I don't think that we should try to make a formal theory of what they are doing. Yeah, well, of course, another objection, which is probably along the same lines, is that, we're not so able to calculate a lot. And so these rules, if we're going to have a rule, it should be one that you could sort of apply qualitatively fairly quickly, because you can't calculate something very well. But, at the racetrack, they also sell these little calculators.
Oh,
You
really?
put in data from the crib sheet, and it will calculate for you.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
My question is about casuistry.
Yeah.
Is it possible that we can be stuck in some kind of infinite regression? For example, I just keep trying new criteria until, well, it works, or I just die.
Yeah.
Simply. For
Yeah.
example, God could be a good example. Some people believe in God so much that whatever the evidence is, how many criteria will fail, they will keep trying and trying over
Yeah.
time.
Yes, to say yes, but here's another condition, and under this condition something else is in force, and then again you say, yeah, but you're not doing that, and they say, yeah, but there's still another condition. Right? No, I know. I think Pascal is right that casuistry can be Marx's game, and of course what he thought was the Jesuits, who were advising rich people, were actually, showing them how they could feel at ease with things that were wrong. Right? Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm not sure if I understood not of what you said correctly, but maybe I can correct it. Based on a probabilistic point of view, it seems like our opinion needs to always fit in with what we can measure.
Yeah.
But it seems also that sometimes science takes some leaps by having kind of a grand view of things.
Yeah.
It might not be correct, but so out of those, the idea of having bigger whole that totally unrelated to some of the statistics that we have can fit in.
Yeah.
Having more.
No, I think that this is a very, very important problem, and because we have to admit the possibility and value of things like scientific revolutions, right? So that there will be cases where we think that the change in opinion was not following any policy with respect to the evidence, but rather a drastic change, right? In which new concepts were developed. And so I am convinced that formal epistemology must allow for policies that allow for these gaps. Rational to say, I'm going to follow this new conception, even though so far I cannot use evidence to justify it. And in Bayesian epistemology, there seems to be no room. They don't have anything to right? But in the history of science, we see this happening again and again. Galileo said it was a good thing that Copernicus didn't listen to the evidence of his senses. And we don't want to say that this was a bad thing to happen, right? Galileo was right that the evidence was against Copernicus. But we also think Copernicus was right to just go with his, insight, what we now call an insight. Yeah. So that's why I insist that epistemology should be voluntarist. Now, today, there are certainly people who are arguing strongly against this. For instance, Roger White. He has a number of articles in which he tries to prove that it is totally irrational to think that he could have any kind of leeway for decision in managing your opinion. So it's an issue. I think it's an important issue that you're bringing up.
And maybe along the same line, isn't science reduced to try to describe what happens and not try to describe what there is or what is the
the point of view I take is this. Whatever is useful, the scientists should be able to use. So if developing models that have hidden mechanisms turns out to be a very useful device, right, then they should use them. So I don't, saying scientists ought not to postulate unobservable entities. But I think that's definitely a mistake. They should postulate whatever they want for their theories. But the empiricist point of view is then just that the criterion of success will be the empirical success of the theories. It doesn't really matter whether the mechanisms are really there.